Hi, so we're gonna have a little more fun now. After the depressing video of, oh no, my channel's dying, there's copyright strikes, blah blah blah, now we're gonna learn about Mahjong. So this Wednesday I'm giving a talk at this thing called Learning Night. It's an event, a series of events that a friend of mine started. They have chapters now, I think, in Waterloo, Toronto, San Francisco, maybe other places. It's like a really super informal version of TED Talks. Basically, if you have some sort of interest, you can go up and share it with people and give like a 10-15 minute talk. It's a Q&A and stuff. The topics are like extremely broad. I've given them before on basic income. I've given one on the appeal of literature. I've given one on Super Smash Bros. That I did with my friend, kind of on competitive Melee and how that works. And now I want to talk about Mahjong, because I love Mahjong. And if you're a fan of this channel, you know that I love Mahjong. And I thought it would be kind of fun to give the talk on YouTube as a way to kind of practice it and make sure I remember everything I'm going to say for Wednesday. And kind of time it, see how long it's going to take. Obviously, it can't be the exact same format because I can't really ask questions and stuff. Like right here at the start, my plan is to ask people, how many of you play Mahjong? And I'm expecting probably not many people, if anyone, will say they play Mahjong. But then I'll say, how many of you play board games? And I think, specifically this crowd is really into board games, and then just people in my age group in general, like board games are huge these days. There's like 5 board game cafes in my city. And then I'll also ask, how many of you play card games, like euchre or bridge or cribbage? And then I hope a few people are kind of into things like that as well. And my thesis is sort of that Mahjong is a really cool fusion or kind of halfway point between those two genres. That it has sort of the personal experience of a board game. I'll kind of get into this more later. But it still has a bit of a detachment and luck factors and kind of the more relaxed, laid-back fun of a card game. And the point of this talk isn't to teach people how to play Mahjong. We're going to cover... How do I advance slides? We're going to cover really briefly the basic mechanics of it. But if you know Mahjong, you know that it is actually a pretty complicated game, and the learning curve at the start is really high. Which might go against what I said earlier about it being kind of relaxing and social and fun, but it really is just more getting over that hump. And that's not something that we can feasibly do in 15 minutes. That would take probably 2 or 3 hours to get through all of the nitty-gritty details of Mahjong. But again, it's not really so much about convincing you to want to play Mahjong as it is about just showing the value of this sort of game or this sort of hobby in your life, and maybe asking, do you have an activity like this that kind of provides these things for you? And if not, maybe that's something you should consider. Alright, so the first thing we're going to look at is the tiles that you play with. There are 3 suits that go from 1 to 9. The Manzu tiles, the Sozu tiles, and the Pinzu tiles. There are also 7 honor tiles. So whereas these are all numbered, you might not be able to read Chinese numerals, but you probably get the idea. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. These ones are not like ordered in any specific way. They're just kind of standalone tiles. These 3 are called the dragons: the white dragon Haku, the green dragon Hatsu, red dragon Chun, and then the 4 cardinal directions of wind. So there's 4 types, or 4 copies of each type of tile, so that's 136 tiles total. So this is how you play. You get 4 people. Each person draws a hand of 13 completely random tiles. On each turn, you draw a tile from the remaining tiles, and then you choose another tile that you don't want anymore, and you discard it. And your goal is to complete your hand. So what does that mean? You're trying to make sets of 3. These are called melds. These can either be 3 of a kind, like you see here, or a run of 3 in the same suit. Pretty simple. The honors tiles, as you might expect, can only make triplets. They can't make runs of 3. So you're looking to get a tile that will complete everything into either a meld, a set of 3, or a pair. So you want 4 melds and 1 pair. So this is a complete hand. You can see 1 set of 3 here, 1 set of 3 here, 1 set of 3 with the 2 I just drew, and 1 set of 3 here. And then we've got our pair, so that's 4 and a pair. This hand is done. Since I've drawn this, it means I've won the round. So when you win, oh, this is just another thing I wanted to show first. I think one of the appeals of Mahjong, at least for me, and this is something that you see in a lot of board games, is this sort of development that you start with something very chaotic, and then slowly you can see it evolve. Like here, I've discarded some of the tiles I don't need. I've kind of made it a little more structured, and you can see it kind of evolve into the final form when it's done. That might give you a sense of just sort of how these things progress. So at each stage, basically what you're doing is determining which tile is the least necessary for your hand to continue. So, everyone starts with some amount of points. Standard is 25,000, but depending on how long you want to play and how many rounds you want to do, you can change that. So when you win a hand, the other players all contribute to the points you win. There's no creation or destruction of points. It's like a net zero game. The points are only just moving between players. And then you win by, at the end of all the rounds, you have the most points, or if someone dips below 0 points, the game ends immediately, and whoever has the most points at that point wins everything. These, of course, like pretty much everything I say, have variations depending on what kind of rules you're playing, if you're playing competitively, if you're playing for money or whatever. So the amount of points you get is proportional to certain conditions that your hand meets, and these are called yaku. You can think of them as sort of, I don't know, just kind of like hand qualities. So these are some examples of yaku. If you have 1 through 9 all in the same suit, that's worth more points. If you only have one suit in your hand, that's worth more points. If you have triplets of those honor tiles I mentioned, like 3 of the red dragon, that's worth points. If you have 2 of the exact same run, like 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, both in the bamboo tiles, that's worth more points. And the rarer they are, like the more difficult it is to meet that condition, the more points they're worth. This is where a lot of the complexity of the game comes from, is remembering all the different yaku, remembering how much points they're worth. And it's not kind of, it's not simple either. There's 2 types of points, and depending on what conditions they meet, you get more of one or more of the other, and then you kind of multiply them together in this complicated way that, again, we're not going to get into right now to figure out your actual total points. This is by far, in a way, the hardest part, I think, is just memorizing all this stuff, but you figure it out eventually. It's something that kind of comes to you as you play. You start kind of recognizing, oh, okay, this hand is worth around 3,000 or whatever. So, the other major element in this game that's pretty unique compared to like a card game is that when you discard a tile, it's all very visible and ordered. So here we can see a shot of what's known as the pond. This is your discard area. And for each player, you can see they've all their discards starting from here, going across. So this can provide a lot of information. First off, just on which tiles you ought to expect to draw. So if you're waiting on a specific tile to complete your high valuable hand, but then you see all of them are in the discards, all 4, you know that you gotta change strategy and adapt. And then it also kind of gives you some information on the state of your opponent's hands. So, let's talk about some kind of basic strategies to the game. You can tell already that there's a lot of luck. Like either you're going to get the tiles you need or you don't. There's no skill involved in drawing them. You just kind of have to hope and pray. But that's not a bad thing necessarily. I think a lot of people really underrate luck as a mechanic that keeps games kind of fresh and interesting and kind of adds a few elements that we'll get into later. The major thing that probably jumps to mind is that because the more kind of complicated and rare and conditional a hand is, the more points it's worth, there's a big trade-off between trying to get a valuable hand and trying to complete your hand before everyone else. Because if someone else completes the hand, you know, the round is over, you start again with a new random hand, all that progress you've made is pointless. So I think this is kind of the major dynamic of Mahjong, is knowing when to just try to complete the simplest hand possible and when to kind of hold back and wait for something more expensive. So you can use a lot of statistical information to figure out the likelihood of drawing any given tile at any given time. You can look at all the discards, look at your hand, think about how many tiles are left, and work out whether it's good odds or not to stay going. But that's actually like pretty much impossible in a fairly fast game like Mahjong. So what ends up happening is you start to develop a real intuition where you're not actually counting every single tile and doing math in your head. You just have like a general sense of what could happen. I think this is really cool. I think this is something fairly unique to kind of playing games, that you can kind of see this skill progress really like before your eyes. And it kind of leads to the personal style of play that we're going to talk about later. The other big aspect is defensive play. This is a really key mechanic that if you play the tile that someone else needs to win, the 14th tile that they need to complete their entire hand, you have to pay all the points to them. So instead of having the hand's value distributed between the other 3 players, you have to pay basically 3 times as much right out of you. So you don't want to do that. So at a certain point, it's actually sometimes best to fold. And unlike poker, you can't just kind of throw everything in and say, all right, I'm done this round. You have to keep drawing and discarding and stuff. So instead of advancing your own hand, you just really focus on not discarding tiles that other people might need to win. So you can try to determine what's dangerous, again, based on statistics, based on your intuition, but then also things like player habits. You can do kind of reads. This is a fighting game turn where basically you're getting into your opponent's head and just figuring out, based on what you know about them, what they're likely to be waiting on, what tiles are dangerous to them. So I think now we're going to kind of talk about the appeal of Mahjong. So these two elements kind of combined into a real spectrum of personalities that kind of manifest themselves in how you play. And unlike a game, say, like, I don't know, Dungeons and Dragons or something, where you're making like big personal choices on how you want to play, but the choices are very, I don't know, substantive, right? Like, oh, do I kill the villager or not, or whatever? And that reflects your personality. Whereas in Mahjong, you're never going to be asked directly, are you a defensive player? Are you an aggressive player? Are you a risk-taking player? Are you a conservative player? It's more that over the course of dozens and dozens and dozens of small decisions, you start to develop this sense of personal style. And you might actually be surprised by like how you find yourself playing. I'm not really advocating Mahjong as some sort of deep, intense personal therapy or anything, but it's sometimes fun to say like, oh wow, I don't know why I thought I could get away with that. I don't know why I'm so hell-bent on getting this certain yaku or whatever. And the nice thing is, because of this factor of luck, even when you kind of screw up, maybe you deal into your opponent's hand, maybe you lose the round, maybe you keep kind of going in on bad ideas, you never really feel like your personal style is getting completely rejected, right? There's sort of this attitude of, you know, shogunai, the Japanese for it can't be helped, that I think is really key to the mentality of Mahjong. Sometimes you just lose, and that's fine. So what this adds up to is a good sweet spot in what I would call personal investment in your play. So I've made this chart, you can see it better. I've made this chart showing games from low personal investment to high personal investment. So obviously something like Dungeons and Dragons, which is a role-playing game, you're literally playing as a character that represents yourself. Your choices can be pretty much any choice that you can make in real life. Whereas on the other hand, you have something like Candyland, where the deck of cards is shuffled and you just draw one. So it doesn't really make a difference whether you're drawing one or one person is drawing for everybody or like a machine is drawing one. At least with something like Snakes and Ladders, you know that you personally are rolling the dice, so it feels like there's a little more investment of yourself. But Mahjong I would put right in the middle, alongside kind of games like chess or Go or whatever, where you have strategies, you have kind of levels of play that reflect your personality to some extent. But at the same time, there's a lot of choices that are like pretty obvious and standard, and you never really feel like you're getting too invested, which I think is kind of a point where a lot of people might get frustrated or they might stop having fun, is you get kind of over invested, and then when you lose, it feels like kind of a personal attack. But then again, on the other hand, if you're not invested at all, that's probably not fun. That's probably pretty boring. So to me, Mahjong is in a really sweet spot, just on both sides of this. The other really nice thing about Mahjong, or kind of games and hobbies like Mahjong, is that it's something that you can kind of think about and discuss outside of the game. So here are some examples of Mahjong media, which is an extremely popular genre in Japan. We've got, live action TV dramas, anime, manga, comics. This one is particularly insane. It's re-envisioning historic events if the world leaders, instead of settling their disputes through debate and war, they settle it through Mahjong. It's fantastic. There's also a lot of Mahjong strategy guides that I really find very fascinating and kind of satisfying to read. Not many of them are in English. This is a good one that I got in English. You can see here they just really thoroughly break down the ramification of choices and discuss them from like a statistics perspective. But again, because of just the overload of information and the uniqueness of every single situation, you can never rely entirely on advice like this. It's always going to be, the ideas that you get from sources like this, like watching other people play or reading books, but then kind of filtered through your own personal style and your personal sense of risk-taking. And then I think the really best part of it for me is that Mahjong is a very low-stress game. And I know the crowd I'm speaking to here, I don't want to use any negative words like workaholic or anything. I think I've been really trying to figure out what I'm going to say at this point to try to get this point across, but it's like, a lot of these people, man, I think they need to relax. They need to take it easy. This continues my tradition of putting JP memes in all of my slideshows. I had like some Japanese cooking bird reference before. That doesn't matter. Yeah, like in Mahjong, I think you can kind of let go of a sense of your hobbies need to be like productive or they need to be challenging to you or whatever. It's more just sort of relaxing. Like most of the time you know exactly what tile to discard and what direction to go in because you've developed this sort of expertise and intuition and stuff, and it comes very naturally. So that in itself is a very nice feeling. And then there are exciting situations where you really feel like, oh man, I don't know what I'm going to discard, I don't know what's going to happen with this hand, but the development of them isn't really within your control. Like you can't seek out exciting situations, they just sort of emerge naturally through luck and stuff. So that keeps the game like really kind of fresh and interesting without being kind of overloading and intense and overstimulating. And again, just this idea that you aren't so personally invested that anything that can happen in the game feels like an actual attack on yourself, or that makes you feel like, oh god, I gotta reevaluate everything. But there's still some element that it's your play, that you're playing in a unique way that reflects yourself that's very satisfying. So in all, it's just a nice social game. It's relaxing, it's fun. I think it's very unique mechanically. You can think about it kind of outside of the confines of the game, which I think is cool. There's a lot to love. It's a great game. So you guys can't ask any questions because it's YouTube. You can put questions in the comments. And do you think that you have any hobbies that kind of fit this pattern? Because I really don't think Mahjong is unique. And even in my own life, I grew up playing euchre with my family. I've played cribbage and bridge. And I think they all have these same sort of appeals to me. I just think Mahjong is maybe the game I've enjoyed most in these categories. So yeah, I think it's something to think about, something kind of good to have in your life, a game where you feel stimulated, you feel challenged, you feel like you're expressing yourself, but it's not stressful, it's not something where you feel like you ought to be in every control of it, it's not something where you feel like you ought to be productive somehow, it's just sort of a fun experience. And this is a really good place to practice. It just is a flash version of it that puts you up against computers. You can kind of like start to glean some of the subtleties of the rules just by going through it. Wow, this is not a great hand. Yeah, that's about it. Okay, that's my Mahjong talk. It took me 20 minutes here, but I had a bit of an intro spiel and stuff too. So that's fine. I think usually during these talks too, people kind of discuss during it if they have questions and such, so I'm sure it'll work out fine. Looking forward to giving it. So yeah, that's all for that.